The guards watched from the sidelines, murmuring their own surprise. One jotted in his journal that he'd never seen tough guys break down over sweets. Another cracked a joke that if the fighting dragged on, the military might go broke, handing out candy to foes. But under the humor, a restlessness brewed. These were meant to be fierce types, forged in the fires of their leaders' rage. Yet there they were, dabbing at their eyes with rough hands, brought low by a bit of sugar. Maybe conflict wasn't just about firepower and explosions. Maybe it was also about loaves and treats, emblems that cut deeper than doctrines. The camp settled into an uneasy slumber that evening. Some dreamed of family, others of banquets they couldn't quite explain, a few of sisters and mothers staring at bare dishes. The wrappers crinkled in the shadows like small banners of yielding, not to troops, but to a plain fact too basic to dismiss, that goodwill could strike harder than malice. Come dawn, the men stirred for another feed, but nothing could wipe away the instant when sobs mixed with peanut spread and chocolate. They'd sampled this new land, and it carried flavors of opposites, bounty and remorse, delight and grief, and they couldn't shake the puzzle, nagging at every soul. If a place could spare treats for its adversaries, what more might it hold? By fall, the enclosure no longer seemed like a pen for beaten souls, but a peculiar in-between realm where the storm of battle couldn't fully penetrate. The fences stayed put. The guard posts loomed high. But within the bounds, daily life adopted patterns that felt nearly routine. Prisoners got up at first light, lined up for chow, and downed portions that still amazed them. Yet what stuck longer than the meals was the gradual unfolding of meetings, instances that muddled the divide between keepers and the kept, rivals and folks next door. It started with labor shifts. According to the rules of fair treatment, captives could work as long as it didn't aid the fight directly. In this vast countryside, that meant gathering crops. Groups of German captives stepped out under the wide open sky, watched but not shackled, and got to picking in stretches of maize, fluff, and grain. Local growers, with their boys away in the fray, eyed these strangers tending chores once handled by kin, now strewn across distant fields. At the outset, distrust loomed thick, but as the yields piled up quicker, as storage filled with bounty, thanks took over from fatigue. Some left containers of cool drink in the shade. Others slipped portions of dessert in wax wrapping. A kid, no more than 10 years old, dashed to the barrier and silently passed a candy drop to one of the workers. Carl accepted it, grinning awkwardly, the tiny burst of flavor deep and meaningful. The captives, used to wariness, couldn't grasp such acts. Weber, tough and blunt, grumbled that it was all a show. But when he came back from the plots one dusk with his pockets stuffed, from a fruit handed by a grower's spouse, he savored it bit by bit, reluctant to voice what the offering had stirred. The reality was unsettling. The opponent's warmth wasn't limited to Army-issued bars. It trickled in from the locals themselves, persistent as weeds breaking pavement. In the quarters, makeshift bonds formed between watchers and the watched. A fresh-faced guy from the heartland, barely 20, swapped his smokes for little wood figures the Germans shaped in downtime. Another shared basic words in the local tongue, hello, thanks, while getting back greetings in theirs. These swaps were minor, almost silly, but in the drag of lockdown, they turned into vital threads. Chuckles pierced the quiet, and though the clash still stormed far off, inside the barriers the vibe edged toward calm. Tunes bridged those gaps too. Some spots got tools for music via aid packages or nearby gifts. A worn keyboard ended up in a dining area, and soon captives played classics from their homeland after the evening meal. The melodies floated past the wires, making folks nearby halt their tasks to hear, startled that foes could draw out such grace. On the eve of the holiday, keepers stepped into the space and stood hushed as the group sang an old tune, voices soft but firm. For the locals, it rang familiar in their words. For the others, it echoed youth. For a short spell, no outfits divided them, just people linked by songs in a chilly hall. Even as these touches eased doubts, a tension lingered. Some keepers chafed at the openness shown to those they'd learned to despise. They recalled surprise attacks, beach landings, or buddies fallen in wooded fights. Seeing captives dine well, make music, and share laughs hit a sore spot. One leader muttered that these folks had taken his relative's life, and now they got treats from the fields. But directives stood firm, and the nation wouldn't ditch the principles it claimed to champion. That strain floated like haze, unsaid but keen. The captives wrestled their own mixed feelings. Appreciation battled shame. In notes sent home, screened but revealing, they mentioned tidy lodgings, solid eats, and surprising decency. Cautious not to brag, but unable to hide facts. Some feared their loved ones would resent them for thriving in ease, while partners and young ones scraped by in shattered towns. Carl, scratching by faint glow, admitted tasting sweets, but skipped the details. He noted instead that he was well, secure, and regretful. Weber turned quieter over time. He'd arrived sure of triumph, echoing phrases like shields, but each day of plenty, each fair deed, wore down that assurance. He admitted once, in a low tone, that he no longer knew the real foe. His nights filled not with triumphs, but with lines for bread in his city, his partner's drawn features. When a watcher offered gum with a smile, Weber nearly chuckled at the oddity, working it until the taste faded, eyeing the lump as if it hid some key to the world's balance. Clashes still flared, times when grips tightened and moods boiled. A few held tight to old allegiances, mocking goodwill as frailty. They hissed plans in the shadows, pushing for defiance, even breaks. Some attempted, dashing into open land only to get rounded up, but most stayed put. Where to flee? Outside lay plenty, not hostility, and deep inside, a weight grew with each sunrise. If the other side treated them better than their own heads had, what did that reveal about the struggle they'd joined? Kids from the area became unexpected links. On rest days, eager youngsters crowded the edges, flinging small balls, chews, or bits of drawn paper. The responses came in shaped wood animals, birds, or quick drawings of structures. The swaps turned regular. Watchers permitted it, shaking heads but grinning slightly. Carl shaped a small steed for a lad who yelled appreciation before bolting. Weber, who once frowned at such things, ended up outlining a farm animal for a girl who laughed at his stern look. Each stayed the steady connector. During gather celebrations, area women prepared desserts and shared extras with the sight. The captives, amazed, took bites slowly, as if sampling not just fruit and sweetness, but the crumbling of every belief they'd brought over the waves. It wasn't staged outreach, it was genuine, raw, and baffling, scaring them more than any barrier could. One twilight, as chill set in, Carl rested by the divide, gazing at the light fading over the flats. Weber sat with him, quiet at first. Then he spoke softly, measured. "I figured power was the hard grip, the stomp of feet, the snap of shots," he said. "But maybe it's something else, sharing with those against you without worry." Carl agreed silently, words failing. The breeze carried hints of burning logs, the buildings aglow against the dimming view. From somewhere, lively tunes played on a device, bold and upbeat. The spot was no haven. It remained confinement, ringed by spikes, weighted with yearnings for elsewhere. But in those limits, something quietly bold emerged. Those who'd stepped under old banners now grasped treats, swapped quips with overseers, shaped playthings for rivals' offspring. The fight shifted from arms to convictions, and which would last when peace arrived. As the season of gifts neared once more, bundles came loaded with sweets, produce, and even small containers of fizzy drink. The group assembled, opening them with care. Carl's grip shook lifting a bar, recollections clashing with now. Weber, peeling back a holder, murmured, If this is what they spare for us, imagine for their own. Around, folks chuckled, wept, raised toasts. But beneath the cheer, a query deepened, somber and clear. If outreach stretched this wide, what might it achieve when the clashes finally ceased? Snow drifted gently across the camp, softening the crunch of boots on gravel and turning the barbed wire into delicate threads of frost. It was Christmas Eve in the year 1944, and while the war raged fiercely in Europe, here in America's heartland, a fragile peace hung in the air. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, a chilly space lit by kerosene lamps, where the scent of pine from a simple tree mixed with steam from cooking pots. On each table sat Red Cross packages, brown paper bundles tied with string, their contents almost too good to believe. Cans of fruit, packs of cigarettes, tinned meat, and once again, the familiar weight of Hershey's chocolate. The men unwrapped them with care, as if handling sacred items. Carl turned the bar in his hands, his eyes gleaming with more than just hunger. He whispered that his sister back in Hamburg hadn't seen sugar in months, that kids were cracking teeth on bread made from turnips. Weber sat rigid, the foil crinkling under his fingers, and muttered that this was harsh, this sweetness that couldn't reach across the ocean. Yet when he took a bite, his jaw quivered, and he looked away so no one would see his tears. Voices rose around the hall in carols. The Germans sang "Silent Night," their tones soft and steady, and to their surprise, the American guards by the doors joined in with the English words. For a brief moment, the room held no foes, just people sharing songs under the warm glow of lantern light. Chocolate squares melted slowly on tongues, blending with memories, sorrow, and the comfort of blended voices. Tears flowed openly now, not from embarrassment, but from realizing that humanity had outlasted rigid beliefs, if only for one evening. Yet the sweetness carried a bite. Every mouthful brought guilt. How could they savor plenty while their families went hungry in the ruins of Dresden and Berlin? Letters from home spoke of bombings, of starvation that carved hollows in faces, of children clutching thin blankets against the cold. Some prisoners couldn't finish their chocolate, wrapping it up to save as a keepsake, a reminder of both generosity and loss. The foil shimmered like silver in the lamplight, as fragile as the edge between enduring and despair. Weber spoke later that night, his voice low, carrying across the bunks. "All my life," he said, "I thought power meant an iron grip, the stomp of boots, the crack of rifles. But here, I see a different kind of power, a nation that feeds its enemies when it could let them starve. That is true strength." No one replied, but many lay awake, staring at the beams overhead, the weight of it pressing like snow on the roof. The Americans grappled with their own contradictions, too. Some guards felt resentment watching prisoners enjoy treats their own families could hardly afford. Others, moved by the sight of men weeping over chocolate, started to question if winning meant more than just fields of battle. One officer wrote in his journal that he'd expected hate to toughen him, but instead he felt pity for those behind the wire. "They aren't soldiers anymore," he noted. "They're just people, hungry for more than meals." Spring arrived, bringing the war's shifting tides. News trickled in, Germany crumbling, cities in flames, old promises falling apart. The prisoners listened, caught between fear and a sense of release. Some still held on to old loyalties, but many whispered that defeat was coming. The real struggle wasn't about whether their homeland would fall, but what kind of people they'd become when it did. The chocolate, the peanut butter, the pies from locals. These had sown doubts in the ground of their former convictions. Carl admitted one evening that he no longer dreamed of awards or marches. He dreamed of taking his sister to a place where bread stayed soft and candy wasn't a wonder. Weber, who once shouted rallying cries, now spent time carving small toys for nearby kids, his hands steady, his quiet no longer angry, but reflective. The camp hadn't shattered them with hardship, it had eased their defenses with simple decency. When the time came to head home, the men walked out the gates with less arrogance, but more questions weighing them down. They carried little, some carvings, some letters, and always the echo of sweetness. Years later, many would talk of this land not as an opponent's territory, but as the place of chocolate and peanut butter, of plenty that had unraveled them more than any fight. Some even came back, settling in the years after the war, drawn by the pull of that remembered warmth. Records showed the impact plainly. Out of the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who passed through these camps, a good number said their views shifted more from everyday kindness than from losses on the battlefield. Experts called it learning without lessons, the subtle influence of bread and sweets. Where speeches failed, a chocolate bar worked. And yet the sweetness always held its edge. Those who lived through it remembered sobbing over candy, not because it tasted good, but because it felt unjust, proof that the war had taken not just lives, but honor, had twisted truths about rivals, had left children starving while fathers savored treats in chains. That contradiction, sharp as foil, stayed embedded in their thoughts long after peace. In the years that followed, some of those men shared tales with their grandchildren, not of clashes, but of chocolate. They described the flavor as both gift and hurt. The instant they saw the world was bigger than the chance they'd learned. They'd admit the tears came not from frailty, but because for the first time in ages they felt purely human, tasting sweetness without dread. The war wrapped up, the camps cleared out, and the fields returned to stillness. But the picture endured. German fighters, hands calloused from work, holding candy like treasures, eyes damp in the glow. In those wrappers lay a truth hard for history to pin down. Sometimes the tiniest offerings bear the deepest lessons. A gun can end a life. An explosion can spread fear. But a piece of chocolate can undo convictions, crack the shell of rigid thinking, and remind even rivals of the shared vulnerability. Carl never forgot the night he pressed a chocolate square to his lips and thought of his sister's empty dish. Weber never let go of the fruit from a farmer's wife, the shared dessert in quiet. They left carrying those moments like hidden marks, unseen but lasting. For them, this land would never just be a foe's ground. It would always be the place that brought tears with treats. And so the tale doesn't close with celebrations or pacts in far-off rooms. It fades here, in a hushed camp under drifting snow, where sobs blended with sugar, where the war's toughest were undone not by force, but by compassion. The wrappers still whisper in recollection, delicate as whispers. And one fact echoes through time. It wasn't the fences that broke them. It was the chocolate.